Thank you. Thank you, Demby, for the introduction. Normally, I speak, giving a PowerPoint presentation, but Demby informed me there's no way to do that here, so I'll use the PowerPoint, and you can just guess at what's on my screen. I guess I was sort of invited to talk on some reflections on catch shares and communities, future generations, and bycatch. At least that's the way I sort of set this up. And it's quite a privilege to be here. I thought I'd open with a quote from somebody that some of you may remember. This is from 1985. I wonder what effect the share quota systems, and if you need a translation, that was the name we had before we had ITQs, and that was the name we had before we had catch shares. I wonder what the effect of the share quota systems would have on Alaska's coastal communities or industries. That's Dave Herrnstein, who used to be mayor of Kodiak in 1985, and I was younger then, and I wasn't living here in '85. The answer he got back was the typical one from the expert community, from an economist at the University of Washington that was proposing this share quota system for the halibut fishery. He says, well, I suppose I don't know. And I'd like those questions to be on the other side of the ledger. What I'm interested in and what I think we need to focus our attention on is the aggregate effect over the entire U.S. economy, initially ignoring the question of how particular groups are going to come out. And he went on to say, there's no shortage of opportunity for you to raise the question of how is this or how is that community going to come out. So I was present when there was a meeting when they first tried to introduce this idea, the proverbial government flying into, we're here to help you, at Fisherman's Hall here in Kodiak. He never fished halibut after that meeting. I ran into him 20 years later. He's still here. I'll leave him nameless, but I did mention Dave Herrnstein. When I was going to graduate school at Berkeley, one of my advisors said to me, it only takes one idea to get through graduate school. And I didn't know what that idea was for a long time, and ultimately I wrote my dissertation. I think it's on Dave Herrnstein's question. What would the effect be on communities? The standard prescription, basically worldwide, for these types of programs involves giving freely these privileges to select vessel owners based on catch history. They're indefinite, they're transferable, and increasingly in modern times, they're wrapped in a rhetoric of deregulation and property rights. And there's also a standard observable effect now. We have, worldwide 30 to 35 years of experience with these programs. There's a standard pattern of effect on communities. What I'm passing around, I don't know if there's enough of them. I tried to make some of these when I realized I wouldn't be able to project. It goes with the peninsula sticking up. So that would be, actually, wait a minute, no. Let me orient you on this. Yeah, peninsula sticking up. That's Denmark. And this comes from a PhD student over in Denmark named Jeppe Host. Denmark introduced a catch share program in 2005. And Jeppe has gone back and done a comparison 2005 to present being, for the purposes of the illustration that you've got, 2010. These are all historic fishing villages. The yellow balloons signify fishing villages that have 50% fewer vessels than they did in 2005. The red balloons signify fishing villages that have no fishing vessels compared to 2005. And the minute I saw this graphic, I asked Jeppe for a copy of it because I instantly recognized this could be Alaska, this could be the north coast of Iceland. This is the characteristic pattern. These programs are designed in their current incarnation to produce consolidation. And they're fine for individual boat owners. I'm not so sure they're fine for communities, at least in the current way they've been developed. And I call this sort of unleashing institutional cannibalism as ports eat each other. Now, the second thing I said I would mention is effects on future generations. I've been quite lucky over the past 2 years to go literally all around the world and give talks sort of similar to this. And I was in Australia 2 years ago by the invitation of the state of Victoria, and I was talking about worldwide experience with these types of programs on communities and on future generations. And there was an advisor there who was Kiwi. He was a New Zealander, he's Maori, in fact. He got quite irritated with my emphasis on the intergenerational effects and the effects on young people as prices continue to go up of these now, privatized privileges. And he came back quite strongly in public with this. Young people in New Zealand do not aspire to own quota. It is too expensive. Young people in New Zealand aspire to own boats and fish quota owned by the corporations, including Maori corporations. And I asked him to repeat the quote so I could write it down, and then I at the time remarked, in fact, oh, so you're transforming future generations into sharecroppers. Now, he was quite, adamant that there was nothing wrong here, and I respect that. I think my major point to you is you're facing profound public policy choices. We know what the effects are. I'm not here to tell you one's right or one's wrong, but we know what those effects will be. In Tasmania, where I was this summer, for example, they did an ITQ program in their abalone dive fishery, and they have had a similar transformation where the divers who were initially issued the quota, most of them over time, divers are kind of a happy-go-lucky crowd, they sold off their quota share, and now there's a new type of person in the industry in Tasmania who is just a quota owner. Has never been a diver for abalone, and they live on the hill in Hobart, and they manage their wealth, and 60% of the quotas are owned by an American who is not an abalone diver and never participated in it. So again, and they just contract. They now act as if the divers are just contract laborers. I think this is a characteristic pattern. You're seeing it in Alaska, in leasing, in red king crab and halibut. And I think, I sympathize with you. You're not fishery managers. You're city and borough managers. You've got a lot on your plate. A lot of this is being promoted via privatize or perish message, as if you don't have any other alternatives. And I think that's wrong. People are confusing a tool with an ideology. The tool is simply just pre-assigned catch. That's what makes the difference operationally on the water, and you could do that in many ways. And my message to you is that you've got a choice between actively designing your future versus saying it's too complicated, this makes my head hurt, and leaving it to others to decide. And here, there's an example of this coming from the European Union. Europe has a decadal policy process for their fisheries, and they're just going through that. And I was invited over there a couple of times in the past year. And initially, the proposal to reform the European fishery policy was featured mandatory ITQs. That was the draft that was floated. And then at the end of it, the politicians had included a phrase in their position paper that said, member states must therefore take care that the system leaves no room for speculations or situations that are detrimental to regions dependent on fisheries. And I told them this was dangerously close to being naive. They were creating this system and then telling the member states. It'd be as if the council created a program and then told the communities, well, be careful that there's no adverse effect on your community or speculation going on in quota shares. We have 30 years of experience in Alaska. In the world, we have probably 40 years of experience. I would quibble with something that Denby just read out of that planning document. There are no unintended consequences. We know what the consequences are. When I showed this slide here, I gave a talk in Copenhagen, and the architect of the Danish system was interviewed at the same time. I could have shown you a YouTube clip if we could have gone multimedia here, where he was proudly defending the program, saying it's doing exactly what they intended. And then he talks about the consolidation, the concentration onto 100 million kroner vessels from all of these disappearing vessels. So I don't think it's credible anymore for people to say these are unintended consequences. And, well, what's the alternative, or plural alternatives? And here I think it takes a lot of courage. Because they're all nice people that come in front of you and come in front of the North Pacific Council. But by and large, these are boat owners, and they're asking you for things that are good for boat owners, present generation of boat owners, and that's not synonymous with what's necessarily good for the community. And again, I think we know that. We've known it for 50 years, here I'm quoting from Milner Schaefer, who's one of the founding sort of fathers of modern fishery science, but very early on he talked about the economic theory that was behind limited entry and catch share systems, and he said many social and political considerations enter into the choice involved here. Those people lucky enough to have received the initial allocation. And, you know, I just heard that your roads are bad. I just heard that the hockey rink needs a new compressor. When I was in Tasmania, where they've got, you know, the American owning majority of the fishery, the lease fees in Tasmania and the abalone fishery are 85% of the landed value. There's people that are doing the work that are making a go of it on 15%. And I just heard it today. I had a conversation with some people here in Kodiak where they said, well, you know, but if you had a municipality collecting the lease, we wouldn't want to gouge the fishermen. Nobody ever talks about fishermen gouging fishermen. 85%? What could you do with that? And I told the Tasmanians, it's as if you got this money out of the ocean and you piled it on the beach and then you looked the other way while the American took it. This is what we're doing in fishery management with these programs. So the public policy question, I think, is just simply who should be the lessor? Private giftees or existing public owners? And the reality is that you would then be actually using a market. All right, I'll try and finish here. So one message is accountability. You, and I mean you collectively, everybody in the Alaskan fisheries sort of arena, may be poised on the edge of an effectively irreversible policy action. In theory, all these things are reversible. In practice, they almost never are. Iceland is trying to back out of their program, and they basically can't do it. The political stakes are so high. Denby sort of mentioned this. The initial design is what matters. In the past, we were told, oh, just get it over with, design the program, the market will sort it all out. That's not what we now know. We know that the initial design is what matters. And so I would say to you, be very wary of we'll fix it later approaches, especially from the community perspective. We're great at focusing on individual vessel owners. But the communities, the experience here has been that the council has come along later, some of this when Denby was commissioner, and tried to sort of patch things up. That's very, very difficult to do after the fact. A second hugely ignored area is the importance of transition. We tend to just make these sweeping changes in these programs and we do them overnight. And particularly when there is talk, there's never very much talk, but when there's talk about crew or when there's talk about community, you hear concerns about, well, the existing investments, especially of the boat owners and the processors. And my answer to that is existing investments matter. I mean, surely you do need to have a sort of a compassionate and a thoughtful transition to whatever new system you go towards. But existing investments can't translate into a permanent claim on the future. That's what's happening. And another lesson that I think we've learned, and this one again I sort of drew out of the European experience, one of the things the Europeans said when there started to be some pushback against this idea of mandatory ITQs for all fisheries, they said, well, we're only doing it for the big boats. The Europeans, they said, only boats over 12 meters. And that response back was, so therefore we're not really harming the small-scale sector. Because of the wealth transfers that are involved here, the analogy I've offered to people, I've said, look, picture a residential street, and the government comes along and gives all the homeowners on the right-hand side of the street parcels of free land worth in excess of $1 million each. And they give none to the homeowners on the left-hand side of the street. Do we say that the government hasn't affected the people on the left-hand side of the street? It's almost impossible to isolate the effects of the giveaway style programs. Finally, what about bycatch? I'm not exactly sure where you're heading with this resolution that I've heard people talk about IBQs. I mean, I think you have to be careful that IBQs can become backdoor approaches to rationalization of the whole fishery. Maybe that's not what is envisioned this time around. I do think that one of the things that's been really overlooked is the ability under catch share style programs to use indexes or indicators of performance that you want to reward, because you have an annual allocation of your actual catch. And you could index that by any performance sort of standard you want. So if you could collect the data on bycatch rates, you could compare every individual's bycatch rate to, say, a fleet-wide average. Some people would be rewarded, some people would be penalized. There's tremendous, and you could do it on social grounds too. Are you hiring local people? You know, we do this all the time in other sectors of the economy with bid preferences, say, for example, with minority firms in federal housing contracts. So there's an untapped potential there to use multipliers to meet ecological and social goals. In conclusion, I would just come back to Mayor Herrnstein's question from almost 30 years ago. You are talking about the future of Kodiak here, and I would repeat, I know it can be sort of overwhelming. You've got budgets to deal with, bumpy streets, melting ice rinks. But this is a fishing town, and you're talking about the future of Kodiak, and can you afford not to really get into this? If the community matters, then I think you have to address it now. And you do have options that are not frequently discussed. Whether or not you want to go there, that's another matter. But I think that the worldwide experience points in a direction where you do have options. That's it. Thanks.